The cold night air pressed down like a weight thick and suffocating. Echo's fur stood on end as he paced restlessly, his ears flicking at every distant sound. Jesse Harper, a battle-worn veteran, scanned the dark woods with narrowed eyes. There was something wrong here. Then came the scream, sharp, jagged, a cry that cut through the silence, echoing through the trees. Echo's head snapped toward it, low growl rumbling from his throat. Jesse froze, heart pounding in his chest. Where the hell did that come from, he whispered. But the answer was already too close. Then, a shadow moved. And it wasn't just the wind. Jesse's breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the rifle strap. Echo was already moving, stepping cautiously through the underbrush, his body low and tense. The scream had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed felt even worse. The woods were too still, the kind of stillness that only came before something bad. Jesse moved forward with slow, deliberate steps, keeping close to Echo, the dog's sharp senses guiding him like a silent beacon. "Come on, boy," Jesse muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Let's find out what we're dealing with." But as they approached the clearing, Jesse's gut twisted. There was no sign of anyone or anything, only the moonlight broken by the dark shapes of trees. And then, through the corner of his eye, he saw a flash of movement too quick to catch. Echo's growl deepened, but this time it wasn't just the wind. Jesse Harper stood at the edge of the clearing boots, firmly planted in the cool, damp soil. The wind carried the scent of pine and earth, but there was something else hidden underneath the faint, bitter edge of something old, something forgotten. He exhaled, watching his breath puff out in a slow, steady cloud blending with the evening fog that rolled over the valley floor. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the world wrapped in a blanket of darkness that seemed to stretch forever. In the silence, the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves disturbed by the occasional breeze. The quiet should have felt comforting, peaceful even, but it didn't. The stillness was too absolute, too heavy. It reminded Jesse of the calm before a storm, the kind of eerie silence that set his nerves on edge. Something was wrong. The air had thickened, charged, with an energy that he couldn't quite place, but he felt it in his bones like a warning. Echo, the black and brown shepherd, was already several steps ahead, his head low, his body tense with focus. His eyes flicked back to Jesse for a moment, as if to check that he was still there, still moving. Jesse's heart stuttered at the look. There was no mistaking the urgency in the dog's demeanor. Echo had been his partner in every sense of the word for the past 5 years, but it wasn't just the bond of companionship that kept them together. It was the dog's ability to sense things that Jesse couldn't. Echo's instincts were sharper than his own, honed by years of service before they met. The dog could smell danger before it appeared, could hear things in the wind that Jesse would never pick up. And right now, Echo's instincts were telling him something Jesse wasn't ready to face. Jesse adjusted the rifle slung across his back, a weight that felt all too familiar. It wasn't the weapon that made him feel uneasy, though. It was the emptiness of the woods, the space between the trees where something could be hiding just out of sight. The same kind of emptiness that had followed him back from the war. The kind of emptiness that never really went away. His hands, rough from years of hard work and harder memories, tightened around the straps of his pack. It was a simple one, well-worn and familiar, but inside it were the few essentials he needed. Extra rounds, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and Echo's favorite blanket. The little things that made up their life now. It had been a long time since he'd needed much more. When he left the military, Jesse thought he was walking away from everything, walking away from the things he had done, from the people he had lost. But the truth was, it wasn't so easy. The past followed him as close as his shadow. And now here in the stillness of this place, it felt closer than ever. He took a step forward, following the dog as it moved deeper into the clearing. The ground was damp underfoot, the air crisp, a sharp bite to it that tugged at his jacket. Jesse pulled it tighter around his shoulders, but the cold wasn't what bothered him. It was the heaviness that seemed to hang in the air, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Echo's pace slowed, his head swiveling from side to side as his nose caught the faintest scent of something in the air. Jesse froze, instinctively glancing around, his senses on high alert. The dog's muscles were coiled, his every movement deliberate, controlled. Echo had been trained to hunt, to track, to protect, skills Jesse hadn't realized he would need in this quiet corner of the world. But life had a way of shifting, of pulling you back into the unknown when you least expected it. Jesse's eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, the line of trees that separated the open space from the thick woods beyond. The darkness there seemed deeper, almost impenetrable, and as he stared into it, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Echo's growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a low, menacing sound that Jesse had heard only in the most dangerous of situations. "What is it, boy?" Jesse murmured, his voice barely a whisper, the words swallowed by the night. Echo's eyes never left the dark, his stance unwavering. There was no mistaking it now, something was out there. something just beyond the trees. Jesse's pulse quickened. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in the same way he felt the weight of the rifle against his back. It wasn't a comforting sensation, it was a warning. Jesse took another step, his boots grinding against the gravel, the sound sharp in the otherwise silent night. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, faint but undeniable. He stopped, his foot frozen in mid-step, his eyes narrowing. This wasn't just his mind playing tricks on him. There was something wrong in the air. Echo was already moving, the dog's nose twitching, as he moved forward closer to the tree line. Jesse's gut twisted. The dog's behavior wasn't just unusual, it was urgent. His instincts were in overdrive. Jesse had learned to trust Echo's judgment, and if the dog was reacting this way, it wasn't without reason. The hairs on his neck stood up as he moved to follow, rifle ready in his hands, his senses on full alert. The world around him felt quiet, too quiet, as he followed the dog deeper into the woods. The trees here were tall, their branches heavy, with years of growth, casting long shadows that made the night feel even more oppressive. The path was narrow, overgrown with underbrush, but Jesse barely noticed. He was focused on the dog, whose every step seemed measured, deliberate, as though Echo was guiding him through the forest towards something hidden. Jesse's breath came out in short, controlled bursts. He could hear Echo's paws padding softly against the ground, his breathing steady, but the silence around them was suffocating. The air seemed thick, like it was charged with something unseen. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made Jesse jump. He wasn't used to being this on edge, not after all these years. But there was something about this place, about this moment, that felt wrong. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees began to thin, opening up to a small clearing. Jesse's heart raced. The tension in the air was palpable now, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But Echo didn't hesitate. The dog moved forward, nose to the ground, as if he was leading them somewhere important. Jesse followed, his hand tightening around the rifle, his fingers gripping the worn stock. Then, without warning, Echo stopped dead in his tracks. Jesse froze. His heart skipped a beat as his eyes searched the clearing, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The darkness here felt heavier than before, like it was closing in on him. He could feel the weight of the shadows pressing in the silence, ringing in his ears. A shadow moved. Not in the trees, not in the corner of his eye, but directly ahead in the center of the clearing. Jesse's breath hitched. He didn't need to see the figure clearly to know it wasn't good. The shape was too still, too unnatural. It was just on the edge of the clearing, hidden in the dark, but not quite out of sight. Jesse's hand instinctively moved to the sidearm at his hip, but he didn't draw it yet. He didn't want to make any sudden moves. The last thing he needed was to tip his hand to whoever or whatever was watching. Echo's low growl rumbled again, this time louder, more intense, a clear warning. Jesse glanced at the dog, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a shiver run down his spine. There was no mistaking it. Echo wasn't afraid, but he was alert. He knew something Jesse didn't. Jesse's eyes never left the shadow. He could feel it now, the heavy presence of whatever was out there waiting. But it didn't move. It just stood there still, like it was waiting for Jesse to make the next move. "What the hell do you want, Jesse?" called out, his voice steadier than he felt. His grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't know if it was a man, an animal, or something else entirely, but whatever it was, Jesse was done waiting. The shadow didn't respond, didn't move. Echo took a step forward, his hackles raised, and Jesse followed. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Not in a rush, not with urgency, but simply vanished. Jesse's breath caught in his throat. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the same. This time it wasn't peaceful. It was ominous. Something had just stepped out of the shadows, and Jesse couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished. He glanced down at Echo. The dog was calm now, almost too calm. The urgency had dissipated, but Jesse could feel the pulse of the unknown in the air around them. And then, without a word, Jesse moved forward. He didn't know what was out there, but he was going to find out. Jesse didn't know how long he stood in the clearing, staring into the empty space where the shadow had been moments before. His senses were on overload, the tension in the air so thick it felt like he could cut it with a knife. Echo, always. The stoic one was unusually. Still, his ears flicking as though he too felt the weight of the silence. Nothing, Jesse muttered to himself, but the words felt hollow. He'd lived too long on the edge of danger to ignore what had just happened. The shadow that moved and vanished without a sound wasn't just a trick of the light, nor was it the wind shifting the trees. Something was out there. The wind had died down, leaving only the rustling of the underbrush to fill the empty space between them. Echo's eyes never left the trees, and Jesse's gut twisted, the unease growing stronger. The dog was on edge, and when Echo was on edge, it meant trouble. Jesse swallowed hard, taking a slow step forward, eyes scanning the tree line. The faintest noise, a crack of a branch breaking underfoot, made him freeze. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice more steady than he felt. But the only reply was the soft breeze pushing through the leaves, the kind that never seemed to carry answers, only more questions. Echo let out a low growl again, a vibration deep in his chest. Jesse turned his hand instinctively, falling to his sidearm, though the gun was still tucked safely in its holster. Echo was alert, more so than he'd ever been on these walks through the woods. The dog's senses were usually spot on, but this was different. It was as though Echo was waiting for something to happen, something he already knew was coming. "All right, boy, let's get back to the cabin." Jesse tried to sound casual, but the words didn't come out right. The urgency in Echo's stance was clear. The dog wasn't just reacting to the usual sounds of the forest. There was something more, and Jesse's instincts were starting to scream at him, to turn around to head back to the cabin, lock the doors, and never look back. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling to him from the shadows, pulling him deeper into the woods. Something unfinished. Something connected to the past he'd been trying so hard to outrun. As if on cue, the wind picked up again, this time carrying with it a faint scent that stopped Jesse in his tracks. It was hard to place, metallic, tinged with the bitterness of rust, but it was unmistakable. The smell of something familiar. "That's not right," Jesse murmured, eyes narrowing. Echo's head jerked toward the trail they had just walked down, his nose working the air. His hackles were raised again. Jesse could feel his pulse quicken, his breath suddenly shallow. The forest was too quiet, and the smell it lingered stuck to the back of his throat like a memory he couldn't quite reach. Without thinking, Jesse started moving toward the trail, his boots crunching softly beneath him. Echo was right at his side, the dog's every step synchronized with his own. The smell grew stronger the closer they got to the edge of the woods, and Jesse's gut tightened. Whatever had been in the clearing was following them. They stopped at the trailhead, the trees ahead now, too thick to see through clearly. Jesse looked down at the ground, scanning for any signs of movement. The scent was stronger here, mixed with the faintest trace of something else, something like oil or machinery. He dropped to a crouch, his hand brushing against the dirt and leaves. It was hard to see the details, but there were unmistakable signs. Fresh footprints. Deep, heavy impressions in the soft ground. "They're not ours," Jesse said under his breath. The prints were too big, too heavy. The last thing Jesse expected to find out here was a person, let alone someone trailing them in the middle of the night. He'd been hoping for a quiet night, just him and Echo taking in the fresh air and the cool, empty stillness of the woods. But instead, he was left standing in the dark, with the feeling that someone had been watching them for far too long. Jesse rose to his feet, a sense of urgency now pushing him forward. He scanned the area once more, but there was nothing, just the dark looming forest. His instincts told him to keep moving to get back to the cabin and prepare, but the dog's unwavering gaze told him that wasn't the right choice. Without saying a word, Echo took off again, moving swiftly down the trail. Jesse didn't hesitate. He followed his breath, quickening as his mind raced through the possibilities. Whoever or whatever was out there had to be connected to the strange events from the past few days. The odd sightings in town, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. This was no coincidence. The trail twisted ahead, winding deeper into the forest. The footprints were fresh, barely hours old, and Jesse's every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around. But Echo was moving faster now, his nose tracking the scent as he pushed ahead. There was something familiar in the dog's movements, something Jesse had seen before when they were hunting together, tracking down a target in the field. Echo was leading him to something specific. Jesse's grip tightened on his rifle as he moved faster, forcing his legs to carry him through the thickening trees. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but the pace Echo was setting, the urgency in the dog's movements, told him they were getting closer to something. And then ahead in the distance, Jesse saw a faint glow through the trees. His breath caught in his throat. The light was coming from the direction of the cabin, but it wasn't just any light. It was too bright, too focused. Someone was already at the cabin. "No," Jesse muttered the word, coming out as a breathless gasp. His mind raced as he pushed himself harder, Echo right by his side. The dog was relentless, darting through the trees as though he already knew what was coming. Jesse's heart pounded his thoughts, a blur of desperation. The last thing he wanted was to bring trouble to the only place he'd found peace, the only place he could hide from the ghosts of his past. The light ahead grew stronger as they neared the edge of the woods. It was coming from the cabin's porch, but the movement around it was strange. Too much motion, too many shadows. Jesse couldn't make out the figures in the light, but the way they moved, the way they were circling the cabin was all wrong. His hand reached for his sidearm again, but something in his gut told him it wasn't enough. He needed to be smarter than this. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an intruder. It was something more. He could hear voices now muffled but growing clearer. "They're not here to rob me," Jesse realized. They're here for something else. And that something else was going to make tonight a lot more complicated than he ever imagined. Jesse's breath came in sharp bursts as he closed the distance to the cabin. Echo moved beside him, low to the ground, his body taut with readiness, as if the dog could sense the weight of what was unfolding. Jesse's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the rustling of the leaves and the distant chatter of the men around the cabin. There was something off about their movements. They weren't there to sneak around. They were there to make a statement. As they neared the edge of the clearing, Jesse slowed, taking cover behind a large oak tree. He pressed himself against its rough bark, the cold of the wood seeping through his jacket. His heart raced in his chest, but his mind stayed focused, cataloging everything he could hear and see. The cabin was just ahead, nestled at the edge of the trees, its single light casting long shadows across the dirt driveway. Jesse could make out two figures standing on the porch, their postures stiff and purposeful. One was pacing in front of the door, the other standing stock-still, watching the area around them. Both men looked like they were expecting someone or something. "Who the hell are they?" Jesse whispered, his voice barely audible. He turned to look at Echo, whose eyes were locked on the figures. Echo didn't bark. He never did unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he kept low his tail still as the dog scanned the area. Jesse's fingers tightened around the rifle strap on his shoulder. He had no idea what he was walking into, but his instincts told him this wasn't some random trespasser. This wasn't some drunk stumbling onto his property. These men were professionals. He had been through enough covert operations to recognize the signs, the careful stances, the way they moved with purpose, the confidence of men who weren't afraid of being seen. "We need to move closer," Jesse muttered to himself, his mind racing as he watched the two figures. But he couldn't make himself move. Part of him wanted to stay hidden, wait until he knew for sure what he was up against. But the longer he waited, the more dangerous this situation could become. Echo was already stepping forward, inching toward the darkness body, low and fluid, following the line of shadows. Jesse watched him for a second before following, trying to match the dog's pace. Just as they were about to round the corner of the cabin, the voice of one of the men cut through the night air. "Who's out there?" the man called out, his tone calm but stern. "We know you're watching." Jesse froze. He didn't think they had been spotted yet, at least not directly. But there was no mistaking it now. They had been made. Echo Jesse muttered urgently, his hand tightening on the rifle. The dog's ears perked up his head, tilting toward the voice, but Echo didn't make a sound. Jesse waited, trying to control his breathing, trying to think through his options. He could run. He could sprint back into the woods, take his chances with the night. But that wouldn't do him any good. He wouldn't make it far enough. They would catch him. There was only one choice. Jesse moved forward, the rifle in his hands steady as he slid from cover to cover, staying as close to the trees as possible, using the darkness as his ally. Echo, just a few steps ahead, kept moving with precision, no hesitation. Jesse stayed close to the dog, knowing he would need the animal's sharp senses more than ever now. They moved closer to the cabin. Jesse's mind raced as he thought of how to handle the situation. He wasn't going to shoot, at least not yet. He needed information. The men on the porch weren't here for a confrontation, not yet, but if he didn't act fast, they would escalate things beyond his control. His gaze shifted to the porch. One of the figures was holding something in his hand, glinting in the dim light. A knife, maybe, or something else. Jesse couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. He had to get closer, had to figure out who these men were before things went any further. Then, as Jesse stepped into position, the ground beneath his feet shifted a twig, snapping loudly in the silence. The figures on the porch froze. "Did you hear that?" one of them asked, his voice now low and cautious. Jesse cursed under his breath. He had been too careless. There was no turning back now. Before the men could react, Echo darted from the shadows, leaping into the clearing with a loud bark. Jesse didn't hesitate. He followed immediately, charging toward the porch rifle, raised his eyes locked on the figures. The men on the porch reacted immediately, reaching for weapons, but they were too slow. Jesse had already closed the distance, his voice cutting through the night as he shouted, "Don't move!" The figures stopped, their hands still hovering near their sides, but they didn't raise their weapons. Jesse could see the tension in their bodies, the way they were sizing him up. They didn't seem surprised to see him, not like regular intruders would have. These men were prepared for a confrontation. They had expected Jesse just as he had expected them. "Who the hell are you?" Jesse demanded, his voice hard. His finger hovered near the trigger of his rifle, though he didn't want to shoot. Not yet. The man who had been pacing stepped forward, hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "We're not here to hurt you," he said slowly, his voice calm, almost too calm. "We've been looking for you, Harper." Jesse's stomach dropped. The way the man said his name made it clear they knew who he was, and that made everything worse. "You've been looking for me," Jesse repeated, his mind racing. He didn't know what was going on, but he could feel it in his gut. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some random encounter. These men had been tracking him, hunting him. We've got business to discuss, the man continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. And we can't do that standing out here. Jesse didn't lower the rifle. What kind of business, he asked, his voice thick with distrust. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what we're here to explain. Jesse's grip tightened around the rifle. Something wasn't right, and if he didn't act fast, he might never get the answers he needed. The man in front of Jesse lowered his hand slowly, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the second figure, a taller man, older with graying hair and a scar running down the side of his face, kept his eyes on the rifle. Jesse could see the flicker of recognition in the older man's gaze. He didn't know whether it was fear or calculation, but it was there like a shadow in his eyes. We've been tracking you for a while now, the first man said, his voice calm, but with an edge of something Jesse couldn't place. We weren't sure if you'd remember. But then we found this place. The words felt like they landed on Jesse's chest, heavy and sudden, as if they were pulling the air from his lungs. You've been tracking me. What the hell do you want? The man stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. We're not your enemies, Harper. We're here for information. Jesse felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Information. The word rang in his ears, familiar and chilling. His first instinct was to reach for his sidearm, but something in the man's posture made him hesitate. He wasn't here to fight. Not yet. But that didn't mean Jesse could trust him. You don't get to come here asking for favors after everything, Jesse said, his voice tight with suspicion. The older man, scarred rough around the edges, spoke up, his voice low but heavy. We don't want favors, Jesse. We need to know what you remember about the Night Ring mission. The mention of the mission sent a jolt through Jesse's spine. His blood ran cold as a wave of memories rushed back. Memories he had buried deep, locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. The Night Ring. The operation that went wrong. The night everything had fallen apart. He had been one of the only survivors crawling through the desert with nothing but his bare hands and the blood of his fallen comrades on his clothes. The ones who hadn't made it, their names burned into his memory like fire. Night Ring, Jesse echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. He gripped the rifle harder, his knuckles white. The past felt like it was reaching out from the shadows, dragging him back into something he wasn't ready to face. What do you know about it? The first man, the one who had been pacing, stepped forward again, his eyes steady. We know enough to know you were involved, and we know it wasn't a failure. It was a cover-up. A lie. Jesse's breath caught. A lie. He couldn't breathe for a moment, his chest constricting, the words too much to process. He had spent years trying to move past the horrors of that mission, trying to leave it behind. But now it seemed the past wasn't finished with him. I don't want any part of that, Jesse said, his voice flat, trying to hold on to whatever shred of control he had left. Whatever you think you know, you're wrong. The older man, still silent, finally spoke. You were there when it happened. You survived because you knew something no one else did. And now people are looking for you, Jesse. People from that operation. And they don't care if you want to forget. They're coming for the information you have. Jesse shook his head, trying to dismiss the memory. The images flooded back too quickly, smoke gunfire bodies falling, his comrades screaming in the night. He had tried so hard to forget, to block it all out. But here it was again, creeping up on him, demanding attention. The first man lowered his voice, the words heavy. We know you were the one who heard the transmission. We know you were the one who could have stopped it, but you were told to let it go. You were told to do nothing. Do you remember that? You remember the orders you were given? Jesse's grip on the rifle tightened again, and for a moment he didn't know if he was going to explode or shut down completely. The memories were like broken glass, slicing through his thoughts. I did what I had to do, he muttered. I did what I was told. But the words didn't feel right. They didn't make him feel any better. They didn't make the past go away. You were part of the cover-up, the man said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. The whole thing was buried, Jesse, and now it's resurfacing. People are coming after you, and you need to remember what happened that night. You need to remember what you saw. Jesse's mind spun, his thoughts tangled in confusion and rage. He wanted to scream, to ask why. Why all of this had to come back. Why couldn't they just leave him alone? Why couldn't the past stay buried where it belonged? You think I don't remember? Jesse snapped, his voice rising with the anger he had kept inside for years. I remember everything. I remember what happened to my team. I remember the betrayal, the orders that didn't make sense. But you don't get to come here after all this time and act like you know what happened. You don't know what it feels like to lose everything, and still be expected to keep fighting. The older man didn't flinch at Jesse's outburst. He just watched him with a quiet understanding that made Jesse feel even more exposed. No, we don't know. But we know it's not over. And we know you're the only one who can help us stop it. Jesse shook his head. He wanted to tell them to leave, to forget him, to go back to whatever hole they had crawled out of. But the desperation in their eyes, the way they spoke like they were running out of time, made something inside of him twist. It wasn't fear. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time. Duty. Duty to the men who had died that night. Duty to the mission that had gone wrong. Duty to the truth that no one had ever spoken aloud. "I can't help you," Jesse said, his voice barely audible. "I've spent years trying to forget. I'm not your hero. I'm just trying to stay alive." The first man didn't argue. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes darkening. "You don't have a choice," he said quietly. "They'll be here soon. And when they do, it won't just be your life on the line. It'll be everyone you care about." Jesse froze. Echo, still standing alert at his side, let out a low growl. The weight of the man's words pressed down on him, and for the first time, Jesse felt the cold bite of something much darker than the night around them. "Why me?" Jesse whispered, his voice cracking despite himself. "Why now?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he just looked at Jesse as though waiting for the truth to sink in. Because the man said softly, "You're the last one who knows." Jesse stood motionless, the words echoing in his mind. "You're the last one who knows." The weight of the statement crushed him, forcing him to take a deep breath to try and push back the memories that were rushing back, flooding his mind with faces, sounds, and the rawness of loss. He hadn't wanted to be the last one. He hadn't wanted to carry the burden of that night any longer. But there was no denying it now. He was entangled in something far bigger than himself. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. Echo, standing silently beside him, looked up at him, sensing the internal battle that Jesse was losing. The dog's presence grounded him, even though Jesse felt like he was sinking deeper into a pit of regret and confusion. The man with the scar stepped forward, his tone softer, now more deliberate. "We don't have much time, Jesse. We're not asking you to relive the horrors of that night. But we need you to remember what you saw before it all fell apart. It's the only way to stop it from happening again." Jesse's eyes locked onto the older man's. Something about him, his calm demeanor, the conviction in his words, made it impossible to dismiss him outright. But Jesse had been burned before. He had trusted the wrong people in the past, and it had cost him everything. He wasn't about to make that mistake again. "I don't owe you anything," Jesse muttered, his voice rough. "I've paid my dues. I've lost enough. The rest of it, it's in the past. Let it stay there." The first man, who had been doing most of the talking, stepped closer, his voice insistent. "You don't get to decide that, Jesse. It's not just your past, it's everyone's. They're coming for the last piece of the puzzle, and you're the only one who can stop it." The words hit like a punch to the gut. They weren't just talking about some shadowy conspiracy anymore. This was personal. The Night Ring operation hadn't just been a botched mission, it had been a setup. A lie so deep, so twisted, that it had changed the course of lives, and it still wasn't over. Jesse turned away, his hand running through his hair in frustration. Echo's gaze followed him, steady and watchful. Jesse knew the dog was waiting for a decision, waiting for him to choose what came next. But there was no easy answer, no simple road back to the peace he had been craving. The past had been buried for a reason. His survival, his sanity, everything depended on that silence. But now the silence was over. It had been shattered by these men, by their presence here, by the threat that was clearly closing in. "Why now?" Jesse asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "Why, after all these years? Why come to me?" The scarred man hesitated, his eyes flicking to his companion before speaking. "Because we've been hunting down the ones who were responsible for the cover-up. The ones who put the mission in motion to begin with. They think they can bury it, erase it. But they're wrong. And now they've found you. They're going to use you to finish what they started." Jesse's heart stilled. The pieces were starting to click into place. He'd been avoiding this truth for years, and now it was finally forcing its way into the light. The Night Ring mission wasn't just a failed operation, it was a carefully orchestrated setup. A plan to eliminate people who knew too much, who might one day speak out about the real objective. The men who died, Jesse whispered the words, slipping out before he could stop them. They were just collateral damage. It was never about the mission, it was about something else. The first man nodded, his eyes dark. "Exactly. And you're the one who knows the key to it all. The one who can stop it." Jesse's mind raced, his thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. The memories of that night, the chaos, the confusion, the broken bodies came rushing back, too sharp, too vivid to ignore. He had tried to bury it all, to forget it, to tell himself that it was over, that his survival meant something. But this was something worse than he had imagined. A conspiracy that had been set in motion long before he even realized it, and it was still alive, still waiting to consume everything around him. Echo growled low in his throat, his body tense. Jesse turned to look at the dog, but before he could say anything, the older man spoke again, his voice heavy with urgency. "Jesse, listen to me. You don't have a choice. They've already found the others. You're the last one left who can stop them from finishing what they started." The finality in the man's words sent a cold shiver through Jesse's spine. He wasn't being asked to help, he was being pulled into something bigger than him, something with consequences that would reach far beyond his own life. The pieces of the past, the lies, the cover-ups were all coming together, and Jesse had no idea how to stop it, no idea who to trust anymore. But one thing was clear. These men weren't going anywhere. They had found him for a reason, and that reason was about to pull him back into the fire. "Tell me everything," Jesse said, suddenly his voice hard and steady. He couldn't back down now. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. The first man nodded, taking a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "We've been watching the people who survived the operation, keeping track of the ones who knew the truth. And now we're getting close to the final piece. You." Jesse didn't flinch. He didn't let the fear rise in his chest. But inside, something was already shifting. The ground he had stood on for so long, his isolated life, his quiet retreat from the world, was crumbling beneath him. The truth was out there, and he was the only one who could stop it from unraveling even further. The scarred man stepped forward. "They'll be here soon, Jesse. You don't have much time. The men who were behind this, if they get what they want, we all lose. It's not just your life at stake anymore. It's the lives of everyone around you. And this time, there will be no way out." Jesse felt the weight of the words settle heavily on his shoulders. He had lived his life, assuming he had escaped the past. But the past was never done with him. And now, the time for running was over. With one last glance at Echo, Jesse made his decision. The dog's steady gaze told him all he needed to know. They would face whatever came next together. "I'm in," Jesse said, his voice clear. "But you're going to tell me everything. No more secrets." The first man nodded, and Jesse knew there was no going back now. The battle for the truth had already begun, and it was up to him and Echo to see it through to the end. Jesse's decision hung in the air like a weight, but there was no turning back. The words had left his mouth, and now the consequences were unfolding faster than he could process. The first man, the one who had been leading the conversation, gave him a short nod as though he had expected no other answer. "Good," he said, his voice steady. "Let's move quickly. Time isn't on our side." Jesse turned to glance back at the cabin, the place he'd tried to make home after everything. The porch light still flickered in the distance, but now it felt like a beacon signaling the inevitable. The peace he had fought so hard to find had been shattered in an instant. Echo stood close by, still alert, his gaze flicking between the men and the dark woods beyond. Jesse had no doubt that the dog was just as unsettled as he was, but there was no hesitation in Echo's movements. They were in this together. The scarred man, he hadn't introduced himself yet, motioned for Jesse to follow. "We need to get somewhere safe. We've got a few hours before they can move in on us. We'll explain everything along the way." Jesse didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were still reeling. Everything he had known, everything he had buried in the past, was coming back to the surface. He wasn't just an observer anymore. He was part of this twisted web, and there was no getting out until the truth was uncovered. They moved quickly but silently through the woods. Echo led the way, his ears perked up, his every step measured and deliberate. Jesse could feel the dog's tension, but also his resolve. Jesse was grateful for the companionship. In times like these, Echo was more than just a protector. He was a reminder of the loyalty and strength Jesse had once felt in the military. The bond between them had always been about survival, but now it was about something more. As they reached the edge of the woods, the man who had been leading them stopped, turning to face Jesse. "This is where we talk." They were in a small clearing now, surrounded by trees that had grown too thick for Jesse to see beyond. The air felt heavier here, suffocating. The quiet of the night felt like it was closing in on him. "I'm listening," Jesse said, his voice low and measured. The first man exhaled slowly, his eyes locking with Jesse's. "You want answers, and we need your help. But you need to understand something first." He glanced over at the scarred man who was standing silently a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the woods, always on alert. "The Night Ring mission wasn't just a failed operation," the first man continued. "It was orchestrated by a group of high-ranking officials, people who wanted to keep certain things, hidden things that could bring the whole operation crashing down. And you, Jesse, you were the one who saw too much." Jesse shook his head, trying to suppress the rush of emotions that flooded through him. "I saw everything. I was there. But I don't understand." "You're saying it wasn't just some screwed-up mission, that there was a plan all along?" The man nodded gravely. "Yes, the mission was meant to fail, but it wasn't just to eliminate your team. It was to cover up something much worse, something no one was supposed to know about." Jesse's mind raced. He had spent years trying to push the details of that night out of his mind, but now the pieces were starting to come together. The whispers, the rumors about corruption, the voices of his fallen comrades still haunting him, it had all been connected to something much larger than he had ever imagined. "You're saying the whole thing was a setup? That we were expendable?" The words were bitter on his tongue, and Jesse's hands tightened into fists. His jaw clenched as memories flooded back, his comrades' screams, their bodies lying in the sand, the fire of betrayal that had burned through him when he realized they had been sent to die. The scarred man finally spoke, his voice low. The people behind it wanted to eliminate a threat, a piece of information that could bring them down. They wanted to cover their tracks, and they used you and your team as pawns. Jesse took a step back, his mind spinning. The anger and frustration boiled over, and he couldn't stop the words from spilling out. Who are these people? Who's responsible for this? The first man's expression hardened. We don't know all their names. We know the higher-ups, the ones who gave the orders, but the people pulling the strings, that's the problem. They've been operating in the shadows for years. But now they're coming after the last of us. Jesse felt the weight of those words settle over him. The last of them. He wasn't just the last survivor of the mission. He was the last one who knew the truth. The last one who had the power to expose it all. And that terrified him. Because now he wasn't just fighting for his own life. He was fighting to uncover a conspiracy that could change everything. "Why come to me?" Jesse asked again, his voice cracking slightly. "Why not someone else? Why me?" The first man didn't answer immediately. He exchanged a quick glance with the scarred man, then looked back at Jesse. "Because we believe you can still make it right. You have the key to unlocking the truth. You saw something that night. Something that none of the others knew." Jesse's mind was reeling, his thoughts tangled in the lies and betrayal he had experienced, and the ones he was just beginning to uncover. He wanted to scream, to tell these men to leave, to go away and take their lies with them. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't walk away from this. Not when everything was hanging in the balance. Echo's growl cut through the silence, his body stiffening, and Jesse turned quickly, instinctively reaching for his rifle. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he scanned the woods, his eyes searching for movement in the shadows. Something was wrong. "They're here," the scarred man muttered, stepping forward. Jesse's heart raced as he tightened his grip on the rifle. The men who had been tracking him, the ones who had already found him once, were they closing in again? "Move," the first man said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to get out of here. Now." Without waiting for a response, he turned and started running, his boots crunching through the underbrush. Jesse didn't hesitate. He followed Echo right at his side, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The urgency of the moment pushed everything else aside. There was no more time to think. No more time to ask questions. They were being hunted. Jesse's heart thundered in his chest as he sprinted through the woods, the sounds of his boots pounding against the dirt, mingling with the crackling leaves beneath Echo's paws. The urgency in the air was palpable, and Jesse knew they couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to wait for the truth to settle. Whatever these men were, after whatever they had dragged him into, he was no longer a spectator. He was in the middle of it now, and there was no going back. The first man leading the way didn't stop or look back. He moved with the speed and precision of someone who had been in the field for too long to hesitate. But Jesse, despite the adrenaline coursing through him, couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. "How far?" Jesse shouted, his voice strained with urgency. "Where are we going?" "Not far," the man called over his shoulder, voice tight. "We need to get to the cache. We have one shot at this, and they're closing in." "Who are they?" Jesse pressed, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he pushed ahead faster, as though he could outrun the questions that were spiraling in Jesse's mind. They ran in silence for several minutes, the woods seeming to close in on them as if the trees themselves were swallowing them whole. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, the ground soft beneath their boots. Echo, who had never faltered, was now alert, his ears flicking constantly in every direction. Jesse knew the dog was sensing something he couldn't quite place, a shift in the air, a presence just beyond the trees. Finally, the man skidded to a halt, raising his hand to signal the others to stop. Jesse came to an abrupt halt, Echo by his side, panting but still watchful. "This is it," the first man said, his voice low but sharp. "The cache is just ahead. We've got what we need to stop this, but it's not going to be easy." Jesse didn't wait for more. The urgency had built to a point where every second felt like a lifetime. "What exactly are we stopping?" he demanded, his eyes scanning the darkness around them. The man's gaze flickered toward him. "The people behind the operation, the ones who sent you in, they're still out there, Jesse. They never stopped working. This cache holds the evidence we need to bring them down. But they know we're coming, and they'll do anything to stop us." Jesse felt the weight of those words settle in his gut. He had been running from this for years, from the mission that had ruined everything. But now the past was coming for him, and for the first time he was going to face it head-on. The truth buried for so long was finally going to see the light of day. They moved forward cautiously, the tension thickening as they reached the edge of the clearing. The air felt different here, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Jesse's neck stand on end. He wasn't just on the run anymore. He was walking into the lion's den, and there was no telling what would happen when he stepped into that final confrontation. Ahead, the cache lay hidden beneath a pile of old, discarded logs. It was a nondescript pile, nothing that would catch the eye of anyone who wasn't looking for it. The first man moved swiftly, pulling away the logs with practiced ease, revealing a metal chest beneath. Jesse's eyes widened as the chest was opened, revealing stacks of files, photographs, and several hard drives. He stepped forward cautiously, his hand instinctively reaching for one of the drives. The man's hand stopped him, holding it back with a firm grip. "Not yet," he said. "We need to get out of here first." Before Jesse could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles broke through the silence, the hum of engines unmistakable. They were already here. Jesse's breath quickened. How many, he asked, his pulse racing. The scarred man stepped forward, his expression grim. Too many. Without another word, the men moved quickly, slipping through the trees, staying low and silent. Echo's body was pressed close to the ground, his instincts sharp as they maneuvered around the perimeter, hoping to stay undetected long enough to get the information they needed. They moved in the shadows, the vehicles now only a few hundred yards away, their lights cutting through the darkness. Jesse could hear the faint clink of weapons and the low murmur of voices as the enemy closed in. There was no question anymore. This wasn't just about survival. This was about exposing the truth, about stopping the people who had buried that truth for so long. And Jesse was done running. As the men approached their last position, the scarred man looked at Jesse, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "We can't do this without you, Harper. It's your decision now." The weight of that decision settled on Jesse's shoulders. The last piece of the puzzle was in his hands. He could stop it. He could expose the truth, bring the people who had orchestrated the Night Ring disaster into the light. But that meant confronting everything he had buried for years. It meant risking it all. Jesse glanced at Echo, who was already poised, waiting for his command. The dog's steady eyes met his, and in that moment Jesse realized something he hadn't fully accepted before. Echo wasn't just his companion. He was a part of this fight as much as Jesse was. The decision was made. With a sharp exhale, Jesse nodded to the men, signaling them to follow. "Let's end this." They moved as one, quickly and quietly, using the cover of the trees to get closer to the vehicles. Jesse's hands shook with anticipation as he reached into his pack, pulling out the file he had grabbed from the cache. The information in his hands wasn't just a weapon, it was his redemption. The group closed the distance, and as they approached the vehicles, Jesse's heart skipped. The enemy was just ahead, their backs turned distracted. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Jesse raised his rifle, steadying his breath. "On my mark," he whispered. The scarred man nodded, signaling the others into position. Echo growled low, his body tense, ready to spring into action. The moment had arrived. The stakes were higher than ever, and Jesse was ready. "Now," Jesse said, and without hesitation he stepped into the clearing, raising his weapon. The first shot rang out loud and sharp in the night. The sound echoed through the forest and chaos erupted in an instant. The enemy spun around, scrambling for cover, but it was too late. The element of surprise was on their side. They were outmatched. Jesse moved quickly, directing the others as they took down the men with precision, each shot echoing with purpose. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the truth, for the fallen, and for the promise they had all made that night to bring down the people who had betrayed them. In the chaos of the battle, Jesse's focus never wavered. His training kicked in. He moved with purpose, each step calculated, each breath controlled. Echo was beside him, swift and silent, taking down enemies with practiced ease. The two of them worked like a well-oiled machine, a reminder of the bond they shared, the loyalty that had kept them alive through the worst of it. When the dust finally settled, the men who had been hunting them lay in the dirt, their weapons scattered around them. Jesse stood over one of them, breathing hard, the weight of the rifle in his hands still grounding him. But it wasn't over yet. He turned to the scarred man. "Now we make sure they never get back up." The man nodded solemnly, stepping forward to retrieve the files. "We've won, but it's not over. Not yet." Jesse nodded, his chest heavy. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew this fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about giving the people who died that night, his brothers in arms, the justice they deserved. As the group made their way back to safety, the weight of the moment began to sink in. The battle was over, the conspiracy exposed, but Jesse knew the consequences of what they had done. The information they had uncovered would shake the foundations of everything they had believed. It would change the world they had known. But it had to be done. The night felt different now, quieter somehow. Echo walked beside him, the dog's steady presence, a reminder of the journey they had taken together. "Let's go home," Jesse whispered, his voice steady but tinged with something more relief, perhaps, or acceptance. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side. And no matter what came next, they had fought for the truth, for justice, and for those who couldn't fight anymore. The world felt still as Jesse and Echo stood at the edge of the clearing, the sounds of battle now distant echoes in the night. The heavy weight of the rifle in his hands felt like an anchor grounding him to the present, but his thoughts drifted back to the past. To the faces of his fallen comrades, their smiles frozen in time, forever etched into his memory. They had paid the price for the truth, and now, at least in some small way, that truth was finally out. Jesse glanced down at Echo, whose fur was matted with dirt and blood, but the dog's eyes were steady, his posture proud. They had done what they set out to do, but neither of them felt victorious. There was no triumph in the silence that now hung in the air. It was a quiet, painful kind of peace, the kind that came after a storm had torn through your life and left nothing but wreckage behind. "We did it, didn't we, boy?" Jesse whispered, but there was no answer from Echo. The dog didn't need to speak. His presence, his calm, was enough. Jesse took a deep breath, finally lowering the rifle and allowing the tension in his shoulders to ease, but the weight of the past would never leave him. No matter how much time passed, he would carry it with him. The memories of the men he had lost. The memories of that night. It was all part of him now. It always would be. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his past, running from the mistakes he couldn't undo, the people he couldn't save. But in the end, he had learned that it wasn't about escaping. It was about facing the darkness and finding the courage to walk through it. He hadn't just fought for the truth. He had fought for the part of him that still believed in redemption. In something more than just survival, Echo nudged his hand, the simple gesture pulling Jesse from his thoughts. The dog's gaze was unwavering, loyal. It wasn't just a bond built on survival anymore, it was a reminder of everything Jesse had been before the war, before the darkness consumed him. Echo was his tether, pulling him back to the world, to the people who still needed him. "We'll be okay," Jesse said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. His voice was steady, but there was something new in it, something like hope. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would get easier, but maybe, just maybe, there was a future beyond the nightmares of the past. A chance for something more, something worth fighting for. Jesse turned back toward the road, the distant lights of the town flickering faintly through the trees. The battle was over, but the road ahead was still long. There would be questions, consequences, and the fallout of everything that had happened. But for the first time in years, Jesse didn't feel completely lost. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't sure what the future would hold. But he had Echo, and maybe that was enough. As they began to walk back through the quiet woods, the first light of dawn began to break across the horizon, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. It was a new day, a day that hadn't been promised to him, but one he had earned step by painful step. The past was still there just beneath the surface, but it no longer held the same power over him. He had faced it head-on and survived. And for the first time in a long while, Jesse felt something he hadn't thought possible again, peace. And with a steadying breath, he walked into the light.